Ethan Miller slammed on the brakes at the entrance to Green Horizon Sanctuary. His hands were sweating on the steering wheel as he stared at the wooden gate with a heavy heart. 5 years had passed since he'd been this close to a horse. 5 years trying to forget. His sister Emily's voice still echoed in his mind. "You need to move forward, Ethan. Visit this place. It'll do you good." He took a deep breath, adjusted the rearview mirror and saw his own reflection. Sunken eyes, unshaven face, hair grayer than any 35-year-old man should have. The scar that cut across his left eyebrow seemed more prominent today. A physical reminder of a past that haunted him. "Let's get this over with," he muttered to himself, getting out of the car. The gate creaked when he opened it, announcing his arrival. A middle-aged woman with curly hair tied in a messy bun and wearing a multi-pocketed vest came to greet him. "You must be Ethan. I'm Martha, the sanctuary coordinator. Your sister called to let us know you were coming," she said, extending her dirt-covered hand. "I'm sorry, I'm always dirty. Life with horses is like that." "No problem," he replied, shaking her hand quickly. "So, how does this place work?" "We're a sanctuary for horses rescued from abuse, abandonment, or retired from competitions. Some arrive in terrible condition, others just need a place to live out their final years with dignity." As they walked around the spacious grounds, Ethan felt every muscle in his body tense. The smell of fresh hay, damp earth, and the characteristic sweat of horses awakened memories he had buried somewhere deep in his mind. "You have experience with horses, right? Your sister mentioned you were in the Mounted Military Division." Ethan merely nodded without elaborating. His eyes scanned the area, observing the animals distributed throughout the paddocks. Some grazed peacefully, others approached the fence, curious about the presence of a visitor. "We currently have 37 horses, each with their own story. Some take years to trust humans again," Martha continued. Ethan followed her automatically, not really absorbing her words. A whirlwind of thoughts invaded his mind. The sound of hooves hitting the ground, the rough touch of manes between his fingers, the rhythmic swaying of a gallop. And then, the thundering noise, the dust, the screams. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push away the images. "Are you okay?" Martha asked, noticing his pallor. "Yes, just heat," he lied. They continued walking to a more secluded paddock, where a single black horse stood motionless under the shade of a leafy tree. Something about that animal immediately caught Ethan's attention. Unlike the others, this one seemed detached from the world around it. It showed no reaction to their approach. "This is a special case," Martha explained. "He was found wandering on a rural road about 3 months ago, malnourished and showing signs of neglect. He had no identification chip or any documents. He's a thoroughbred stallion, at least 10 years old, trained, but I've never seen a horse so—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Absent." Ethan slowly approached the fence, his eyes fixed on the animal. The stallion had a black coat with some whitish spots on its flank, old scars. His bearing was majestic, despite the evident loss of muscle mass. There was something familiar about him, something that made Ethan's heart race. "What's his name?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "We don't know his original name. Here we call him Shadow due to his reserved behavior." Ethan moved closer. The horse finally turned its head, its eyes meeting Ethan's. It was like a punch to the stomach. Those eyes, he knew them. He knew every reflection, every nuance of that gaze. "Sentinel?" he whispered, incredulous. The horse didn't react, but Ethan knew. It was him, the same sentinel that had carried him through the most difficult battles, that had shared the weight of duty with him, the same one that should be under special care after retirement from the Mounted Division. "You know him?" Martha asked, surprised. Ethan didn't answer. A mix of emotions overwhelmed him. Relief, confusion, concern, and above all, a disturbing certainty. Something very wrong had happened. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. "What did you say your name was?" Martha asked, observing Ethan's intense reaction. "Sentinel. This horse's name is Sentinel. He served with me in the Mounted Division for 6 years," he replied without taking his eyes off the animal. Martha frowned, clearly surprised. A military horse? That explains a lot. But how did he end up on that road? Ethan shook his head, equally confused. I don't know. When I left the service, Sentinel should have been transferred to the Cavalry Rehabilitation Center at Fort Carson. That's where all retired Army horses go. Slowly, Ethan opened the paddock gate and entered. Martha made a move to stop him, but something in his posture made her back off. A former military man knew what he was doing, or at least should know. Sentinel, Ethan called softly, extending his hand. The horse remained motionless, its eyes fixed on a distant point. No sign of recognition, no reaction that would indicate familiarity. Ethan moved closer, step by step, until he was less than a yard away from the animal. It's me, partner. Ethan. Nothing. It was like talking to a statue. He risked touching the horse's neck, feeling the rough coat under his fingers. Sentinel didn't back away, but he also gave no sign that he recognized the touch. The staff member watched the scene with curiosity. You say you served together. How long ago? 5 years. After that incident in... Ethan cut off the sentence, swallowing the words. He didn't talk about that day with anyone, not even Emily. Some memories were too heavy to share. In any case, he should be at Fort Carson, he continued, diverting the subject. How did no one report the disappearance of a military horse? Martha approached cautiously. Often animals pass through several owners before they arrive here. Perhaps the rehabilitation center transferred him or even sold him. Ethan shook his head, dismayed. No, there's a rigorous protocol. Each animal is tracked. A stallion like Sentinel, then, he has an inestimable value, both financial and strategic. Heavy silence hung between them. The horse finally moved, but only to step away a few paces, continuing to ignore Ethan's presence. What happened to him? Martha asked, noticing the marks on the animal's coat. These scars? Some are from missions, others... Ethan lightly touched a long scar that ran down the animal's flank. I don't recognize. Something in Ethan's stomach twisted. He knew Sentinel like the back of his hand. Every mark, every habit. This horse before him wore the same skin, but his eyes were empty. Did you perform tests on him? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The basics. Vaccination, deworming, general physical evaluation. Physically, he has recovered from malnutrition, but his behavior remains concerning. He doesn't establish bonds with the handlers, doesn't respond to basic commands that any trained horse would know. Martha paused, hesitant. To be honest, we've already discussed the possibility of neurological trauma. Some horses never fully recover from traumatic experiences. A cold sensation ran down Ethan's spine. He knew that reality well. He himself had never fully recovered. He woke up sweating almost every night, reliving the panic, the screams, the feeling of helplessness. I want to take him. The words left his mouth before he could even think. Martha's eyes widened. What do you mean, take him? Do you have the facilities to care for a horse? Ethan nodded, determined. I have a small property on the outskirts of Cedar Springs. 1 acre, stable, fenced paddock. It was my grandmother's. I've been living there since... He paused, since I returned to civilian life. The coordinator seemed skeptical. It's not that simple, Ethan. We have procedures for adoption. Evaluation of the adopter, prior visit to the location, adaptation period. I'm not talking about adoption, he interrupted, with a firmer tone in his voice. I'm claiming custody of an animal that belongs to me. Do you have any proof of that? Any document proving that this horse is really your Sentinel? The question hit Ethan like a bucket of cold water. Of course he had no documents. Sentinel was Army property, not his personally, but deep in his heart he knew it was him. I can prove it. He has a birthmark under his mane, on the right side, a white half-moon-shaped spot. Martha crossed her arms, challenging. Many horses have similar marks, Ethan thought quickly. He broke his left front hoof in 2017. He underwent delicate surgery. There should be a scar and a small misalignment in the growth of the hoof. The coordinator seemed to consider the information. She approached the animal and squatted to examine the mentioned hoof. After a few moments, she stood up with a less skeptical expression. Indeed, there is an irregularity here, but that's still not enough proof. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to control his growing frustration. I'll prove he is Sentinel, and when I do, I want to take him with me. Something is very wrong with this story, and I won't rest until I find out what happened. His eyes met Martha's, who recognized the unwavering determination in them. She nodded slowly. Let's do this. Start by visiting him regularly. Establish a bond. See if he really recognizes you. Meanwhile, you provide the necessary documents and we'll prepare the process. It was less than Ethan wanted, but it was a start. He looked again at Sentinel, who remained oblivious to the conversation that would define his fate. I'll be back tomorrow, he stated, resolute, and every day after that, if necessary. The car engine roared as Ethan accelerated down the highway. The visit to the sanctuary had turned his world upside down. Finding Sentinel in those conditions was like facing a ghost, a faded version of something that had once been vibrant. As he drove, his mind buzzed with unanswered questions. He turned onto a dirt road that led to his small property. Since leaving the army, that piece of land inherited from his grandmother had become his refuge. A place where no one asked questions, where the silence didn't suffocate him. The simple house, the empty stable, the vacant paddock, everything patiently awaited something he had sworn never to have again. A horse. As he parked, he noticed the lights on the porch. Emily was waiting for him, sitting in the old rocking chair, a cup of tea in her hands. His heart tightened. His younger sister had always known him better than he knew himself. "So?" she asked as soon as he got out of the car, without beating, around the bush. "Did you know?" Ethan returned, his voice a mixture of accusation and disbelief. Emily blinked, genuinely confused. "Know what?" That Sentinel was there. Emily's expression changed from confusion to complete shock. "Sentinel? Your horse at the sanctuary?" She rose, leaving the cup on the railing. "Ethan, I swear I had no idea. I just thought that volunteering with horses might, help." He stared at her for a few moments, looking for any sign of dishonesty in her eyes. He found none. Emily had always been too transparent to hide anything. "I'm sorry," he muttered, running his hand through his hair. "It's just that it was a shock." "I can imagine," she approached, touching his shoulder. "Tell me everything." They entered the house and Ethan reported the encounter while preparing a strong coffee. He described Sentinel's state, the animal's apathy, the inexplicable marks on his body, the confusing story of how he had been found. Emily listened attentively, her brow increasingly furrowed. "It doesn't make sense. How does a military horse simply disappear from the system?" "Exactly what I'm trying to understand," replied Ethan, leaning against the kitchen counter. Sentinel wasn't just any horse. He was one of the best in the cavalry, trained for extreme situations, special missions. His voice faltered, the coffee forgotten in the cup cooling between his fingers. "Ethan," Emily said gently, maybe it's not him. You haven't seen a horse in years. It could just be a similar animal." He shook his head vigorously. "No, it's him. I know, it's him." "Then what are you going to do?" "Take him home, of course." Emily sighed, knowing her brother's determination well. "And then, what happens after that? You spent 5 years trying to distance yourself from everything that reminds you of that day. Having Sentinel here, it would be like living with your own trauma in the backyard." Ethan lowered his gaze, knowing there was truth in her words. Since leaving the Mounted Division, he had lived as a shadow of himself. Sleepless nights, constant nightmares, the guilt that corroded him from within. His therapist called it post-traumatic stress disorder. He called it punishment. "Maybe that's exactly what I need," he finally said. "Maybe Sentinel and I need each other to heal." Emily didn't seem convinced, but she knew her brother too well to argue when he made a decision. "And how will you prove he's yours? Or rather, the Army's?" Ethan left the cup in the sink, a plan already forming in his mind. "I'll need to talk. To people I'd rather never see again in my life." The next morning, Ethan dressed as he hadn't in years. Dark dress pants, a well-ironed shirt, polished shoes. He looked in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the man who stared back. There was something different in his eyes today, a purpose. The headquarters of the 2nd Cavalry Division was an hour from his house. Throughout the journey, he felt his stomach churning. Returning to that place meant facing memories he had, buried in the deepest part of his soul. As he passed through the security gates, he immediately felt out of place. The curious looks from the young recruits, the formality of the officers, the accelerated yet disciplined rhythm, everything now seemed to him like a distant film in which he no longer played a part. "Captain Miller," the familiar voice made. Him turn around. Lieutenant Mendez, now wearing the rank of captain, approached with a surprised smile. The years had been kind to him. The same athletic build, the same keen look, just a few more wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. "Mendez," Ethan greeted, extending his hand. "It's good to see you're still around. And it's a surprise to see you back. I thought you had left all this behind." "I did," confirmed Ethan, "but I need some help, something related to horse records." Mendez frowned, intrigued. "Horse records? Why?" "I found Sentinel." The name had a visible impact on Mendez. His expression went from curiosity to absolute astonishment. "Sentinel, your stallion." "Impossible." "Why impossible?" Mendez looked from side to side, as if checking if anyone could hear them. "Because according to official records, Sentinel had to be euthanized 3 years ago due to a degenerative disease." Ethan felt his blood freeze in his veins. "What? He's alive, Mendez. I saw him yesterday at a horse rescue sanctuary." Mendez led Ethan to a private room in the administrative department, far from curious ears. The place smelled of old paper and reheated coffee. Metal filing cabinets covered the walls, silent witnesses to decades of military stories. "This doesn't make sense, Ethan," said Mendez, closing the door behind him. "I have access to the records of all horses that passed through the division. Sentinel was officially declared unfit in 2021 and referred for the standard procedure." Ethan shook his head, refusing to accept. "He's alive, Mendez. And if there's one thing I learned serving here, it was to recognize my own horse." He sat in one of the chairs while Mendez turned on an old computer. After a few minutes navigating the system, the captain turned the screen so Ethan could see. "See for yourself. Here's the veterinary report, signed by Dr. Valente, and Colonel Bradley's authorization for the procedure." Ethan analyzed the documents, his indignation growing with each line. The diagnosis indicated a degenerative condition in the spine that would render the animal unusable for service and cause progressive suffering. The most humane solution, according to the report, was euthanasia. Everything seemed in order, except for the fact that Sentinel was alive and without evident signs of the alleged disease. "Who performed the procedure?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Mendez scrolled the page, looking for the information. "Here. He was referred to the veterinary clinic, contracted by the Army. Prometheus Institute." "Prometheus? I've never heard of it. It's relatively new. A public-private partnership established by Colonel Bradley about 4 years ago. They take care of most of the animals that are retired or, you know, something." In Mendez's expression caught Ethan's attention. "You don't seem very convinced about this institute." The captain hesitated, averting his gaze. "Look, these are just corridor rumors, nothing confirmed." "What kind of rumors?" "That some animals referred there don't exactly receive the treatment described in the reports." Mendez lowered his voice. "One of the handlers, Silvera, swore he saw one of our horses, supposedly euthanized, being transported alive to another location." Ethan felt a mixture of anger and hope growing in his chest. "I need to talk to Dr. Valente." Mendez let out a humorless laugh. "Good luck with that. He requested a transfer 2 years ago. They say he's working on some private project. And Bradley, well, he retired last year with all the honors." This was getting increasingly suspicious. Ethan took out his cell phone and took a picture of the computer screen, capturing the documents. "This could cause you problems," warned Mendez. "If I'm right, the problems will be for other people." Leaving the headquarters, Ethan immediately called Emily. "Do you still have contact with that journalist friend of yours?" he asked as soon as she answered. Andrew? Yes, why? I need him to find out everything about a Prometheus Institute. It's a veterinary clinic contracted by the army. Ethan, what are you getting yourself into? Something big, Emily. Something very wrong. Before heading home, Ethan decided to pass by the sanctuary again. He needed to see Sentinel, confirm his suspicions, understand what had happened to his partner. Martha received him with a surprised expression. I didn't expect to see you so soon, she commented. I need to spend more time with him, replied Ethan, determined. And I have some questions. They walked to the paddock where Sentinel remained isolated from the other horses. The animal was in the same position as yesterday, as if he hadn't moved. Has this horse undergone any more detailed neurological examination? Asked Ethan, carefully observing the horse's behavior. Martha shook her head. We don't have resources for such specialized tests. Our veterinarian only did a basic clinical evaluation. And who is your veterinarian? Dr. Michael Fields. He comes once a week. He'll be here tomorrow if you want to talk to him. Ethan nodded, entering the paddock. He approached Sentinel slowly, who remained detached. He observed more carefully the scars on the animal's body. Some were old, familiar. Others seemed too recent for a horse, supposedly euthanized 3 years ago. He noticed something that had gone unnoticed on his first visit, small circular marks at the base of the neck, almost hidden by the mane. They looked like needle scars, several of them, forming a pattern. What did they do to you, partner? He murmured, gently touching the spot. For the first time, Sentinel reacted. A slight shudder ran through his body. His eyes momentarily focused on Ethan. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a flash of recognition. You're in there, aren't you? Whispered Ethan. I'll bring you back. After a few more minutes with the animal, he said goodbye to Martha, promising to return the next day to speak with the veterinarian. On the way home, an idea began to form in his mind. If there was a way to prove that horse was really Sentinel, he would need the help of someone who knew the animal well, someone besides himself. His former team partner, Sergeant Riley, had retired around the same time as him, after suffering serious injuries in the same incident. Living in a small town in the countryside, Riley kept himself away from everything related to the army. They had barely exchanged half a dozen messages in the last few years. He stopped the car on the shoulder and looked up the contact on his phone. After a few rings, a hoarse voice answered, "Riley, it's Miller." A long silence preceded the answer. "Ethan, what happened? Did something happen?" "I need your help. It's about Sentinel." Another silence, heavier this time. "Sentinel is alive, Riley, and something very strange happened to him." "What are you talking about?" Riley's voice sounded tense, almost fearful. "I found him at a horse rescue sanctuary. Army records say he was euthanized, but he's alive, modified somehow." "Ethan," Riley hesitated. "Are you sure you want to get involved in this?" That response wasn't what he expected. "Do you know something you're not telling me?" Riley sighed deeply. "Come here. This isn't a matter for the phone." The call ended, leaving Ethan with more questions than answers. The sun was starting to set on the horizon as he resumed the road, now with a new destination. What did Riley know? Why did he seem so apprehensive? The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to move, forming an increasingly disturbing image. The small town of Blue Ridge seemed frozen in time. Old houses with wide porches, a central square with a bandstand, and a church that dominated the landscape. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other by name, and news traveled faster than the wind. Ethan parked in front of the address Riley had sent him by message, a simple corner house with a well-kept small garden in front and an access ramp instead of steps, a reminder of the aftermath the sergeant carried. Before he could even ring the doorbell, the door opened. Riley appeared in the doorway, leaning on a cane. His face, once jovial and energetic, was now marked by deep expression lines. His graying hair, cut in the same military style as always, showed that some things never completely change. "So you really came," said Riley, without extending his hand to greet him. "You knew I would," replied Ethan, noticing the whiskey glass already prepared on the living room table. The interior of the house was Spartan, as expected from a man who had lived his entire life under military discipline. Few pieces of furniture, few ornaments, just the essentials. On one wall, however, a collection of framed photographs broke the monotony. A younger Riley along with other soldiers, horses, medals. "Sit down," indicated the ex-sergeant, limping to an armchair. "How long has it been? 4 years?" "5, corrected Ethan, accepting the glass offered to him. "Since the hospital." A shadow crossed Riley's face. The hospital was a subject both preferred to avoid. "And now you show up talking about Sentinel? A horse that officially no longer exists." "He exists. I saw him." Riley took a long sip, his eyes fixed on some invisible point on the wall. "Something similar happened to me, you know? About 2 years ago. I was flipping through an agricultural magazine in a doctor's waiting room and saw a photo. I swore it was Tempest, my horse. It had the same markings, the same characteristics. But the name was different, the owner was different. And what did you do?" "Nothing," replied Riley with a heavy sigh. "What could I do? I'm just a retired sergeant with a useless leg. I preferred to believe it was just coincidence." Ethan felt the frustration grow. "But I'm certain, Riley, it's Sentinel, and he didn't recognize me. He's different, as if something had been done to him." Riley adjusted himself in the armchair, visibly uncomfortable. "What exactly do you know about Project Cerberus?" The question took Ethan by surprise. "Project Cerberus? I've never heard of it." "Of course not. It was classified. It took shape after you were discharged." Riley stood up with difficulty, leaning on his cane. He walked to a bookshelf and removed a brown envelope hidden between books. Returning to the armchair, he handed it to Ethan. "I was called as a consultant for my experience with elite horses. At first it seemed legitimate. Enhancement of military horse training, increased efficiency in the field, development of techniques for extreme situations." Ethan opened the envelope. Inside, photographs and some documents with a military letterhead. The photos showed facilities that looked like laboratories, horses with electrodes connected to their heads, men in lab coats watching monitors. What the hell is this? Bradley was always obsessed with control. When I served under his command, he was already talking about modifying traditional training. He said animals had untapped potential, but no one imagined how far he would go. Ethan examined the documents, trying to absorb the information. Technical terms, graphs, progress reports. One phrase jumped out at him: complete suppression of emotional memory and implementation of new behavior patterns. "They erased the horse's memories?" he asked, horrified. "Not just erased, reprogrammed," explained Riley, his voice heavy. "The idea was to create perfect horses for combat, without fear, without hesitation, completely submissive to specific commands. Animals that don't get scared by explosions, that don't create emotional bonds that might interfere with missions. Like machines. Exactly like machines." Ethan felt his blood boil in his veins. "And you allowed this? No one questioned it?" "At first, we didn't know the full scope. When I began to realize what was really going on, I questioned Bradley. He assured me the procedures were humane, that the animals didn't suffer. But then..." Riley paused, swallowing hard. Then they started bringing in horses that should have been euthanized or retired. Like Sentinel." Riley nodded slowly. "It was the perfect cover. Who would investigate the whereabouts of an officially dead animal? They could do whatever they wanted, experiment at will, without being accountable to anyone. Why didn't you report it?" The ex-sergeant let out a bitter laugh. "Report to whom? The project had approval from high ranks. Maybe they didn't know the details, but they signed the papers. And then..." His voice faltered. "Then there was an accident in the laboratory. A fire that destroyed part of the facilities. 2 scientists who had expressed ethical concerns didn't survive." Ethan absorbed the information, the pieces finally fitting together. "And this Prometheus Institute? A front. The place where the experiments really happen is on an isolated farm near the Virginia border. I've never been there, but I've heard descriptions. Prometheus is just the entry point, the official place where animals supposedly receive treatment or are euthanized. Riley leaned forward, his expression suddenly alert. Ethan, you shouldn't be involved in this. If Sentinel is really alive, and you start asking questions, they'll notice. These are dangerous people. I'm already involved, replied Ethan, determined. And I won't stop until I get Sentinel out of that situation. The horse you knew doesn't exist anymore. Whatever they did to him, he recognized me, Riley. For an instant, I saw it in his eyes. He's in there somewhere. Silence took over the room. Riley seemed lost in dark thoughts. If you're really determined to pursue this, you need to be smart. You can't just barge in and accuse. They have protection. They have influence. Ethan nodded, already formulating a plan. I'll get Sentinel out of that sanctuary first. Prove it's him, document his condition. Then, with evidence, we can think about the next step. And how do you plan to prove it? Ethan smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. The microchip. Riley's eyes widened. Of course, every cavalry horse has an identification microchip if Sentinel still has his... Exactly. It's just a matter of finding someone with a reader who isn't connected to the army. A small glimmer of hope appeared in Riley's tired eyes. I have a contact, a veterinarian who retired from military service years ago. He has equipment and, more importantly, he's trustworthy. Ethan stood up, feeling a renewed urgency. I need to go. The longer Sentinel stays at that sanctuary, the more risk he's in. Riley also stood up with difficulty. Be careful, Miller. We're dealing with people who won't hesitate to eliminate any obstacle. Before leaving, Ethan paused at the door. Why did you show me this now? Why not before? The ex-sergeant looked away, the guilt evident in his expression. I thought I was protecting you, and to be honest, I was afraid. I still am. But if Sentinel is really alive and you found him, maybe it's a chance to fix something that should have been prevented a long time. So go. Ethan nodded, understanding. Everyone carried their own scars, their own guilt. Keep your phone close, I'll need that contact. The next morning dawned with a fine, persistent drizzle. Ethan drove to the sanctuary with his mind buzzing with information. Riley's revelations had transformed his personal quest into something much larger and more dangerous. It was no longer just about recovering his horse. It was about exposing a scheme that defied all the principles he had once sworn to uphold. Upon arriving at Green Horizon, he noticed a vehicle parked that hadn't been there during his previous visits, a white pickup truck with the logo of a veterinary clinic. Dr. Fields had arrived. Martha received him at the administrative entrance, her hair damp from the rain and a worried expression on her face. Good morning, Ethan. Dr. Fields is already examining the animals. We can meet him in the main stable. As they walked, Ethan tried to probe for more information. How long have you been working with this veterinarian? Almost 2 years. He serves several sanctuaries and refuges in the region. An excellent professional, very dedicated. And has he specifically treated Sentinel, I mean Shadow? Martha nodded. He was the one who examined him when he arrived. He was in deplorable condition, dehydrated with open wounds. The doctor was especially intrigued by those marks on the neck. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold drizzle. Did he say anything about those marks? Only that they looked like scars from medical procedures, possibly repeated injections. Considering the general state of the animal, we suspected continuous mistreatment. The main stable was spacious and well lit, divided into several stalls where horses could be examined or treated. In one of them, a middle-aged man, wearing a white coat over casual clothes, was methodically examining the hoof of a spotted mare. Dr. Fields, called Martha. This is Ethan Miller, the visitor I mentioned. He believes our Shadow is, in fact, a military horse named Sentinel. The veterinarian stood up, adjusting his thick-framed glasses on his nose. His eyes, attentive and intelligent, analyzed Ethan with professional interest. Military, huh? That would explain a lot about that animal, he commented, extending his hand for a greeting. Michael Fields. Ethan Miller, ex-captain of the cavalry. The handshake was firm, professional. I'll finish up here and we can. Talk about your horse, said the veterinarian, turning his attention back to the mare. Ethan observed the man's precise movements, the way he spoke softly to the animal while working, the care evident in every gesture. He seemed genuinely concerned about the animal's well-being. When he finally concluded the examination, Dr. Fields took off his gloves and signaled for them to follow him. "Let's see this mysterious stallion." In the isolated paddock, Sentinel remained in the same distant position, like a sentinel guarding an invisible territory. "Does he always stay like this?" asked Ethan. "Practically," confirmed the veterinarian. "It's as if he were in constant vigilance, waiting for a command that never comes." Ethan and the doctor entered the enclosure, approaching slowly. The rain had stopped, but the air remained humid, heavy with expectation. "What were your medical findings when you examined him?" questioned Ethan, carefully watching the professional's reaction. Physically, besides malnutrition and the evident wounds, he showed signs of chronic exhaustion, as if he had been subjected to an intense work regime without proper care. Neurologically, the veterinarian hesitated. "Well, that's the most intriguing part." "How so?" "His reflexes are intact, motor coordination preserved, no signs of structural brain damage, but his behavior, it's as if he had been disconnected from his own instinct. Horses are social, responsive animals. This one seems to operate under rigid programming." The choice of word didn't go unnoticed by Ethan. "Programming?" Dr. Fields adjusted his glasses again, a gesture that seemed to indicate discomfort. "Perhaps it's not the most adequate term, but for lack of a better explanation, I've seen traumatized horses before. Normally they demonstrate fear, aggression, defensive behaviors. This one doesn't. It's as if he were in standby mode." "I want to confirm if it's really my horse," said Ethan, determined. "He should have an identification microchip. Do you have a reader?" "I have one in my car, yes. It's standard procedure to check all rescued animals." "And have you already checked Sentinel?" The veterinarian shot a quick glance at Martha before answering. "We did check. We didn't find any chip." Ethan felt a weight in his stomach. Could it be possible that he was mistaken, or had they removed the device? "I want to try something," he said, after a moment of reflection. "If it is indeed. Sentinel, there's a specific command that only he knew." Dr. Field seemed intrigued, taking a step back to observe. Ethan approached the stallion, positioning himself directly in his field of vision. He straightened his posture, assuming the old command position he used in the cavalry. "Sentinel watchpoint," he said firmly, using the exact tone he had used hundreds of times in the past. For a moment, nothing happened. The horse remained motionless, vacant eyes. Then, almost imperceptibly, his ears moved, focusing in Ethan's direction. A slight tremor ran through his body. "Sentinel watchpoint," repeated Ethan, now taking a step forward. The stallion backed, chup, as if an electric current had passed through his body. His eyes, previously unfocused, fixed directly on Ethan. There was no recognition in them, but there was something. A reaction, a programmed response to the command. "He was trained for that command," murmured Dr. Fields, fascinated. "More than trained. It was our personal code," explained Ethan. "It means stay alert but in absolute silence. We used it in missions where secrecy was vital." He moved closer another step. Sentinel remained tense, alert, as if he were internally fighting against something. "What did they do to you, partner?" whispered Ethan, slowly extending his hand. To everyone's surprise, the horse didn't back away. He allowed the touch, his eyes still fixed on Ethan, as if trying to decipher a puzzle. "Amazing," commented Martha, who was watching from the fence. "It's the first time he's allowed prolonged contact." Ethan knew this was his chance. He needed to establish some connection, break whatever barrier was keeping Sentinel trapped in that state. Slowly, he took a small metal object from his pocket. An ultrasonic whistle, a tool he used for silent communication with Sentinel during missions. "Let's see if you remember this." He brought the whistle to his lips and blew. The sound, inaudible to humans, caused an immediate reaction. Sentinel shook his head, as if trying to shake off an annoying fly. His eyes blinked repeatedly, his nostrils dilated. Ethan blew again, 3 times in quick succession, the code for approach. Something extraordinary happened. As if awakening from a deep sleep, Sentinel took a step toward Ethan. Then another. His movements were hesitant, almost mechanical, but they were happening. "It's him," affirmed Ethan, feeling a lump in his throat. "It's my sentinel." Dr. Fields observed the scene with scientific fascination. "I've never seen anything like this. It's as if you had activated a switch in his brain." "Not a switch," corrected Ethan. "A memory. Something that not even what they did to him managed to completely erase." Martha approached, visibly moved. "What happens now?" Ethan maintained eye contact with Sentinel, who was now less than a yard away from him, still hesitant, still fighting, against his own reprogrammed instincts. "I want to take him home today. But we still don't have official confirmation." "Do you need more proof than this?" interrupted Ethan, pointing to the animal that, for the first time in months, was showing a reaction beyond apathy. Dr. Fields exchanged a look with Martha, something silent passing between them. "I can perform more tests if you'll allow," offered the veterinarian. "Confirm if there are scars from microchip removal, do a more complete neurological exam." "Do whatever is necessary," agreed Ethan, without taking his eyes off Sentinel. "But today he leaves with me." While the veterinarian returned to the truck to get equipment, Ethan finally did what his heart had been begging for since their first encounter. He approached completely and slowly, wrapped his arms around Sentinel's neck in an embrace. "I'm going to take you home, partner," he whispered against the rough mane, "and together we'll find out who did this to you." The animal's body trembled slightly, as if something inside it was fighting to break through the imposed barriers. It was just the beginning of a long journey, but for the first time in 5 years, Ethan felt he was on the right path. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. The rented trailer swayed gently as Ethan drove down the rural road leading to his property. Through the rearview mirror, he could glimpse Sentinel's silhouette, motionless despite the vehicle's movement. Dr. Fields had recommended mild sedation for transport, but Ethan refused. Instinctively, he knew that more drugs would not help the animal's recovery. The small Miller farm appeared at the next curve, a simple colonial-style house surrounded by pastures and a modest orchard. The stable, built by Ethan's grandfather, decades ago had remained closed since his return to civilian life, until today. Emily was waiting at the property entrance, arms crossed and a worried expression. Beside her, an elderly man leaning on a cane. Dr. Ernest, the retired veterinarian, indicated by Riley. "I couldn't believe it when you called," said Emily, helping to open the gate for the trailer. "Are you sure about this?" "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," replied Ethan, maneuvering carefully. He parked near the stable where everything was prepared according to his instructions. Fresh water, clean hay, basic medications. The space had been cleaned and aired out after years of abandonment. "So this is the famous Sentinel," commented Dr. Ernest, approaching the trailer with slow but sure steps. His eyes, framed by deep expression lines, still maintained the vivacity of someone who had spent his life observing and healing animals. "Riley told me the basics, but I prefer to see with my own eyes." The unloading process was surprisingly calm. They expected resistance, confusion, maybe even panic. Common reactions in horses transported to unfamiliar environments. But Sentinel descended methodically, like a soldier following silent orders. His eyes surveyed the environment, registering every detail without showing emotion. "Extraordinary," murmured the veteran. "I've seen traumatized horses trained to exhaustion, but this... It's as if they had reconfigured his operating system," completed Ethan, guiding the animal into the stable. Once accommodated in his new stall, Sentinel remained standing, motionless, eyes fixed on the opposite wall, as if he were still under constant surveillance. "Shall we begin?" asked Dr. Ernest, opening his case of old but well-maintained equipment. While the veterinarian prepared a portable scanner to check for the presence of a microchip, Ethan gently caressed the animal's flank, talking in a low voice. "We're home. Now, partner, no one is going to hurt you here," Emily observed from the stall entrance, her face a mixture of compassion and concern. "Did Dr. Fields confirm there were marks of chip removal?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "A small, precise scar, in the exact location where military chips are implanted. Surgery done by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Dr. Ernest turned on the scanner and began to pass it slowly over the animal's body, paying special attention to the neck and the region between the shoulder blades, common locations for implantation. Here, he said after a few minutes, the device emitting a weak beep as it passed over a specific point on the right side of the neck. But you said the chip was removed, observed Emily, confused. The military identification chip, yes, explained Ethan, but apparently they put another one in its place. Dr. Ernest adjusted the device, trying to obtain more information. It's a different model from the ones we used in the army, more advanced. I can't read the data with this simple scanner. We would need specialized equipment. Or we could remove it, suggested Ethan, his voice hardening. I don't recommend it, the veterinarian shook his head. We don't know exactly what it is, where it's connected, what function it serves. It could be just identification, or it could be something more invasive. The word hung in the air like a dark cloud. Invasive. How many other things had been implanted in Sentinel besides the chip? What other modifications had been made without leaving visible marks? What else can
we check?
Asked Ethan. The veteran conducted a complete examination of the animal, checking vital signs, reflexes, responses to various stimuli. Each observation was noted in a well-worn notebook, with the meticulousness of someone who had documented thousands of cases over decades. Physically, he's fine. Undernourished, yes, with signs of chronic stress, but nothing that good care can't resolve. Neurologically, however, he hesitated. There's something profoundly wrong. Like what? Pressed Emily. It's as if certain brain connections have been deliberately interrupted, while others have been reinforced. I've seen something vaguely similar in studies on extreme conditioning, but never at this level. This animal has been reprogrammed. The word confirmed Ethan's worst suspicions. What Riley had revealed about Project Cerberus wasn't an exaggeration, it was reality. What kind of monsters would do this? Murmured Emily, tears in her eyes. The kind that sees animals as tools, not as living beings, replied the veterinarian, putting away his instruments. The kind that doesn't recognize ethical limits when seeking efficiency. Ethan stared at Sentinel, who remained unchanged despite all the manipulation and examinations. His eyes, once expressive and alert, now seemed like empty windows. How can we reverse this? Dr. Ernest sighed, the weight of years and experience in his expression. I don't know if a complete reversal is possible. The brain has remarkable plasticity, but when conditioning is implanted in this systematic manner. He paused, searching for words. Perhaps it's more realistic to think about adaptation than total cure. I refuse to accept that. Ethan's voice came out louder than intended. Sentinel is in there somewhere. I saw. Tired when he reacted to the whistle. The veterinarian placed a wrinkled hand on Ethan's shoulder. I'm not saying to give up, son. Just to be realistic. The bond you had may be the way. If something of the old Sentinel still exists, we'll find it in that connection. Ethan nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted. The last 24 hours had been an emotional roller coaster, the revelation of Project Cerberus, the confirmation that Sentinel had been a victim of experiments, the bureaucratic battle to remove him from the sanctuary, and now this. I'll need you to document everything, he said to Dr. Ernest. For every finding, every observation, we'll need it as evidence. Evidence for what? Asked Emily, her tone cautious. For whatever comes next, replied Ethan, his eyes meeting his sister's. This goes far beyond Sentinel now. Who knows how many other animals went through the same. Dr. Ernest closed his case with a definitive click. I'll be here tomorrow to begin a more detailed evaluation. For today, I suggest letting him get used to the environment. Talk to him, stay nearby, but don't force interactions. If there was some kind of aversive conditioning associated with emotional connections, we need to go slow. After the departure of the veterinarian and Emily, who promised to return with additional supplies, Ethan took a simple wooden chair and placed it in front of the stall. He sat down, elbows resting on his knees, observing the stallion he had once known better than himself. It's just the two of us now, he said, his voice low and controlled. No doctors, no tests, no expectations. Just you and me, like in the old days. Sentinel remained motionless, but his ears moved subtly in the direction of the familiar voice. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but to Ethan it meant everything. From his pocket he took out the ultrasonic whistle again. This time he didn't blow it. He just held it in his open palm, letting Sentinel see it. Remember this? Our secret. Our private code. The horse's eyes finally moved, focusing on the small metal object. There was no explicit recognition in them, but there was attention, as if a deep and buried part of his consciousness was trying to access a memory. Ethan smiled for the first time in days. We'll take it slow, partner. We have all the time in the world. The sun was beginning to set when Ethan finally stood up. He had spent hours there, sometimes talking, sometimes in silence, just existing in the same space as Sentinel. At some point, the animal had approached the bars, reducing the distance between them. As he left the stable to prepare his own dinner, Ethan didn't notice the dark car that slowly passed by on the rural road, nor the camera with a telescopic lens that recorded every movement on the Miller property. Somewhere, someone was very interested in Sentinel's return. 3 days had passed since Sentinel's arrival at the farm. 3 days of infinite patience, of small established rituals, of glances exchanged in silence. Ethan had transformed the care of the animal into his only mission. He woke before sunrise, slept long after night had fallen, always attentive to any change in the horse's behavior. Dr. Ernest came daily, meticulously documenting each small progress. And there was progress, albeit subtle. Sentinel now approached. When Ethan entered the stable, he accepted food directly from his hand. His ears moved in the direction of the familiar voice, small victories that to any outside observer would seem insignificant, but to Ethan represented battles won against whatever they had done to his partner. That morning, while brushing the black coat still without its old shine, Ethan noticed something different. Sentinel not only tolerated the touch, he seemed to seek it, leaning slightly in the direction of the brush. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" murmured Ethan, a genuine smile illuminating his tired face. The cell phone rang in his pants pocket. It was Andrew, Emily's journalist friend, to whom he had requested information about the Prometheus Institute. "Andrew, any news?" "I do, but I don't know if you'll like it," replied the voice on the other end. "I managed to gather some data on the institute. It was founded 4 years ago with mixed funding, part military, part private. The official name is Prometheus Institute for Research in Animal Behavior and Performance." "Who are the private investors?" "That's where it gets interesting. Most of the money comes from a company called Neurosync, specializing in neural interface technology. They are pioneers in devices that allow direct communication between computers and the nervous system. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Devices like brain chips? Exactly, they develop technology for treating epilepsy, Parkinson's, spinal cord injuries. At least that's what they say publicly. And who's behind Neurosync? A name you already know. Victor Bradley. Colonel Bradley? Ex-colonel now. Apparently, after retiring from the army, he assumed the position of research director at the company. And more, the Prometheus Institute is located on a property belonging to Neurosync, near the Virginia border. Exactly. As your friend Riley mentioned, Ethan processed the information, the pieces of the puzzle finally fitting together with terrifying perfection. "There's something else you need to know," continued Andrew, his voice taking on a more cautious tone. "While investigating this, I noticed something strange. I think someone is monitoring my searches. I received an anonymous email yesterday suggesting that I focus on less sensitive matters." "A threat?" "Subtle but unequivocal. These people have resources, Ethan, and apparently they don't like curious individuals." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of gravel being crushed under tires. Someone was approaching via the dirt road. That led to the property. "I need to hang up," said Ethan quickly. "Keep me informed, but be cautious." Putting away the phone, he headed to the stable entrance. A car he didn't recognize was parking near the main house, a black sedan without identification, tinted windows, the type of vehicle that screamed official without needing special plates. Two men got out. One of them, younger, remained by the car. The other, a middle-aged man with unmistakable military posture, walked toward Ethan. "Captain Miller," he called, extending his hand. "Colonel Vaughn, Security and Intelligence Division." Ethan didn't return the greeting. "Ex-captain, what do you want, Colonel?" The man didn't seem bothered by the coldness. "Just a conversation. Can we go inside?" "I'm busy. If you have something to say it right here." Vaughn smiled slightly, as if appreciating the directness. "To the point, then. It has come to our attention that you are in possession of an animal belonging to the United States Army." Ethan felt his blood boil in his veins, but maintained a neutral expression. "According to official records, the animal you refer to was euthanized 3 years ago. Hard to be in possession of something that officially doesn't exist." Vaughn's smile disappeared. "Captain, I know you served with distinction. Your record is admirable. Don't complicate your situation by getting involved in classified matters." "Classified?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Is that what they call illegal experiments on animals these days?" "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm here only to inform you that this specific animal is federal property. Regardless of any contradictory records, it must be returned immediately." "To be truly euthanized this time." Vaughn took a step forward, lowering his voice. "Understand one thing, Miller. There are projects underway that go far beyond your comprehension. Projects that can save lives, that can revolutionize our military capabilities. The sacrifice of some animals is a small price to pay. That sacrifice has a name, Sentinel, and he's not just a test animal." The colonel sighed like a father dealing with a stubborn child. "You have 48 hours to hand over the animal. After that, we'll return with a court order and, if necessary, police force. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Turning his back, Vaughn returned to the car. Before getting in, he cast a final look at Ethan. "By the way, I suggest you inform your journalist friend to be more discreet in his research. In these times, excessive curiosity can be dangerous." The vehicle departed, leaving a cloud of dust behind. Ethan remained motionless, feeling the weight of the threat in every unspoken word. They knew about Andrew, they knew about Sentinel. They were probably monitoring his movements for days. Returning to the stable, he found Sentinel agitated. The animal had perceived the threat, even without understanding it. His eyes, more expressive than they had been in days, followed Ethan as he took out his cell phone again. "Emily," he called as soon as his sister answered, "I need you to come here now and bring paper and pen. We can't talk on the phone anymore." Next, he called Riley. "They came," he said simply. "I warned you," replied the ex-sergeant, his voice tense. "What are you going to do now?" "I don't know yet, but I won't hand over Sentinel." "They won't give up, Ethan, if they're willing to expose themselves by coming to your property. It's because the animal is too valuable for the project, or because they know something you haven't discovered yet." Ethan's military intuition, dormant for years, awakened with full force. "Both? Probably. Sentinel isn't just a horse that went through experiments. He's living proof of these experiments, and more than that." He paused, understanding hitting him like lightning. "He's a prototype, a successful test of something bigger." "What are you going to do?" repeated Riley. Ethan looked at Sentinel, who remained restless, his eyes more alive than at any moment since his rescue. "I'm going to fight. The only way I know how." Ending the call, Ethan approached the horse. He ran his hand through the rough mane, down to the scars on the neck where the new chip had been implanted. "They'll come for you, partner. But this time, we'll be ready." The animal fixed its gaze on Ethan, as if finally understanding the gravity of the situation. For a brief moment, something of the old Sentinel shone in those eyes. The deep connection between soldier and mount that not even the most advanced science had managed to completely erase. Ethan knew he had only 48 hours to act. 48 hours to unravel the secrets of the chip, to understand what they really did to Sentinel, to prepare his defense. 48 hours before the full weight of the army and obscure private interests fell upon him. The battle he had avoided for the past 5 years had finally found him, and this time he couldn't dodge it. Night fell over the Miller farm like a heavy mantle. Inside the main house, transformed into an improvised headquarters, the air was charged with tension and urgency. Around the kitchen table were gathered Ethan, Emily, Dr. Ernest, Riley and Andrew, the journalist. All windows had been covered, cell phones collected and turned off. Basic precautions against unwanted surveillance. "Recapping what we know," said Ethan, pointing to the notes spread across the table. Project Cerberus is a joint military-private initiative for developing neural control technology in animals, specifically horses. Commanded by ex-Colonel Bradley, now at NeuroSync. They use the Prometheus Institute as a front for experiments that probably violate several animal protection laws. Andrew complimented. "According to my contacts, NeuroSync recently received a significant contribution from the Department of Defense. There are rumors of a major project in development related to man-machine interface for application in conflict zones." "That explains why they're so determined to recover Sentinel," observed Riley, adjusting his prosthetic leg with discomfort. "He's not just a successful test. He's probably an advanced version of the prototype." Dr. Ernest, who until then had been silent, cleared his throat to call attention. "Considering the neurological signs I observed in the animal and the surgical marks, my hypothesis is that they implanted more than a simple identification chip. It appears to be a neuromodulator, possibly connected to the limbic system." "In English, Doctor," requested Emily. "A device that directly alters emotional and behavioral response, suppressing natural reactions and replacing them with pre-programmed patterns. Which makes him a perfect soldier," concluded Ethan, his voice laden with bitterness. "A being that doesn't question orders, doesn't feel fear, doesn't let itself be influenced by natural impulses. The ultimate goal of any army." A heavy silence took over the room. The implication was clear and frightening. If it worked on horses, what would be the next step? "What are we going to do?" asked Emily finally. "In less than 36 hours they'll be back with a court order." Ethan stood up, walking to the window to peek through a gap in the curtain. The night was clear, starry, perfect for observation, from both sides. "Andrew, can you make this story public? Expose the project?" The journalist shook his head, hesitant. "I can try, but without concrete evidence, it would just be another conspiracy theory. We need documentation, internal records, something that unequivocally proves what they're doing." "And we have something they desperately want," completed Riley, a strategic gleam in his eyes. "Sentinel, or more specifically, what's inside him." Dr. Ernest adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable. "If you're thinking of removing the device, I should warn you about the risks. Without adequate equipment and specific knowledge of the system, we could cause irreversible damage to the animal." "I'm not suggesting removal," explained Riley. "I'm suggesting analysis. If we can understand how it works, how it's controlled, maybe we can use it to our advantage." Ethan returned to the table, a firm resolution in his countenance. "Doctor, Ernest, can the scanner you use detect any type of signal emitted by the chip? Not with precision, it's old equipment, limited, but it detected unusual frequencies, beyond the basics expected for identification. Andrew, do you have contacts in the technology area? Someone who could help us decipher these signals?" The journalist reflected for a moment. "I know someone, a specialist in reverse engineering of devices. Worked for the intelligence agency, left due to ethical issues, extremely discreet. Call her now." While Andrew stepped away to make the call, Ethan continued. "Emily, I need you to prepare legal documents, a formal complaint to the district, attorney about animal abuse and illegal experimentation. Include photographs of Sentinel scars, Dr. Ernest's reports, everything we have. But you said we can't go to the authorities." "And we can't yet. But we need to have this ready for when the right moment comes." "Insurance." Riley observed Ethan with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You have a plan, don't you?" "I do," confirmed Ethan, spreading a map of the region on the table. "If we can't deactivate the chip and prove what they're doing, We'll have to disappear, me and Sentinel." "Run away?" questioned Emily, alarmed. "That's crazy. It's survival. If we hand over Sentinel, they'll use him again as a guinea pig, and then they'll eliminate any trace to protect the project, including everyone in this room." The silence that followed confirmed that everyone understood the seriousness of the situation. Andrew returned to the kitchen. "My contact, Dr. Marina, can help us, but she'll need to examine the horse personally, with specialized equipment. She can be here at dawn tomorrow." "Excellent," said Ethan, turning his attention back to the map. "Dr. Ernest, meanwhile, I need you to tell me everything you observed about Sentinel's behavior patterns, any specific reaction to certain stimuli." The veterinarian consulted his notes. "I noticed something interesting during the examinations. When I used a device that emits low-frequency electromagnetic pulses to test muscle reflexes, the animal demonstrated an almost mechanical response, as if the magnetic field activated some kind of internal protocol." "What kind of response?" "Altered posture, immediate attention, a kind of increased state of alertness, different from a horse's normal reaction to the device, which is usually just mild discomfort." Ethan exchanged a significant look with Riley. "Electromagnetic fields as a method of remote control. It's brilliant and terrifying at the same time," commented the ex-sergeant. "If we can replicate these signals, we could have access to the command system," completed Ethan, "and maybe even subvert it." The night advanced as the group refined their plan, each with a specific task, each aware of the risks involved. Outside, the silence of the rural night was occasionally broken by distant neighs. Sentinel, restless in his stable, as if he sensed that his fate was once again at stake. When they finally separated for a few hours of rest, Ethan headed to the stable. He found Sentinel awake, his eyes shining in the half-light. "Tomorrow will be a decisive day, partner," he murmured, caressing the animal's neck. "We're going to find out what they did to you, and then we'll get justice." Sentinel inclined, his head lightly touching Ethan's shoulder with his muzzle, the closest gesture to affection he had shown since his rescue. A small sign that, despite all the reprogramming, something of the old connection persisted. On the distant horizon, the first rays of sun were beginning to show. A new day was dawning, bringing with it the promise of revelations and dangers. Ethan checked his watch again. Less than 30 hours until Colonel Vaughan's ultimatum. The race against time had begun. Dawn brought with it an almost palpable tension to the Miller farm. Dr. Marina Taylor arrived punctually at 6 in the morning, driving an unmarked white van. She was a short woman in her 40s, with grey hair cut short and a shrewd look behind thin-framed glasses. "Nothing of what we're about to do is strictly legal," was her first observation after the initial greetings. "I hope everyone is aware of that." Ethan nodded gravely. "We are, and we appreciate the risk you're taking." Marina opened the rear doors of the van, revealing a small mobile laboratory, computers, scanners, frequency analysis equipment, and other technological tools that few present recognized. "Andrew explained the basics to me, but I need to see this chip for myself. Where is the animal?" Ethan led her to the stable, where Sentinel remained in a state of alert, as if sensing the importance of that day. Dr. Marina approached cautiously, professional but respectful. "Magnificent animal," she commented, observing the stallion's bearing. "It's a shame what they did to him." While installing her equipment, she explained, "What we're looking for is not just to identify the type of chip implanted, but to understand its exact function, and more importantly, its control system. Advanced neural devices usually operate in two ways. They receive external commands and transmit data back to the controller." "Like a GPS?" asked Emily, who was observing from the entrance. "Much more sophisticated. Imagine a GPS that not only shows location but monitors vital signs, brain patterns, emotional and behavioral responses, and that can potentially influence all these factors remotely." A heavy silence fell over the group. The real dimension of what they were facing became increasingly clear. After almost an hour of meticulous examinations using specialized scanners and radio frequency analysis equipment, Dr. Marina finally stepped back, her face a mixture of astonishment and professional indignation. "It's even more advanced than I imagined," she declared, leading everyone back to the house to discuss her findings away from possible listening devices. What they implanted in Sentinel is a prototype of what we call in the industry a complete bidirectional neural interface. Around the kitchen table, she displayed three-dimensional images of the device on her tablet. "Look here. These microscopic branches extend to specific regions of the brain, particularly those related to emotional processing, memory, and decision-making. It's technology that was still in the theoretical phase when I left the agency." "And what exactly does that allow them to do with the animal?" asked Ethan, his stomach contracting at the answer he already imagined. "Almost total control," replied Marina without mincing words. "They can suppress specific memories, block natural emotional responses like fear or affection, and implement programmed behavior patterns that activate upon predetermined stimuli. In essence," she paused, searching for the right words, "they can transform a conscious being into an automaton." "Monstrous," murmured Dr. Ernest. "And potentially revolutionary from a military standpoint," added Riley, pragmatic even in his horror. "Horses that don't feel fear in combat situations, that blindly obey commands that can be controlled remotely." "Or soldiers," completed Andrew, verbalizing the thought that all shared. "That's the real objective, isn't it? Test on animals to eventually apply to humans." Dr. Marina neither confirmed nor denied, but her silence was answer enough. "There's something even more disturbing," she continued after a moment. "The device constantly emits data to a receiver. Location, physiological state, brain function, everything is being monitored in real time." Ethan felt his blood freeze in his veins. "So they know exactly where Sentinel is. And they've probably tracked every change in his behavior since I brought him here." "Precisely," confirmed Marina, "which explains why they appeared so quickly and why they're so interested in recovering him." "Can we deactivate the device?" asked Emily. The specialist shook her head. "Not without specialized surgery, which could cause permanent damage, but..." A gleam appeared in her eyes. "Maybe we can do something more interesting." Leaning over her laptop, she began to type rapidly. "Every communication system has protocols, specific frequencies, authentication methods. If I can decipher how the signals are sent and received, we could intercept them," completed Ethan, immediately understanding. "Or even send our own commands. Theoretically, yes, but I'll need time, and we don't have much of that." It was Riley who verbalized what everyone was thinking. "And what if, instead of fleeing or resisting, we lured them into an ambush? Use their own system against them?" The morning turned into afternoon as the plan took shape. Marina worked tirelessly, decoding the chip's signals, while the others prepared the ground for the inevitable confrontation. Documents gathered, evidence organized, escape routes established as a last resort. In the late afternoon, Marina finally emerged from the room transformed into an improvised laboratory, exhausted but triumphant. "I did it," she announced. "I not only decoded the system, but found a vulnerability. I can emit a signal that temporarily overrides external commands." "For how long?" asked Ethan. "Minutes, maybe. It's not perfect, but it may be enough for what we need." The group gathered for the final adjustments to the plan, each detail meticulously reviewed, each contingency considered. When night fell, everyone assumed their positions, awaiting the inevitable. Ethan spent the following hours in the stable with Sentinel, speaking in a low voice, remembering old missions, shared moments, rebuilding the bridge that connected man and animal, a connection that went beyond neural commands and electronic chips. "Tomorrow will be the decisive day, partner," he murmured, stroking the stallion's mane. "Trust me one last time." As if understanding the gravity of the situation, Sentinel kept his eyes fixed on Ethan, more alert and present than he had been since his rescue. For a moment, Ethan glimpsed the old companion in his gaze again, the one who had known his every thought before he even verbalized it, who had moved as an extension of his own body in the most dangerous missions. The dawn brought with it the sound of vehicles approaching on the rural road. More than what Colonel Vaughan had promised. Not just a police car, but 3 military vehicles and a black van with the discreet NeuroSync logo. "They're here," announced Riley, observing through binoculars from the porch, "and they brought reinforcements." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every decision made in the last hours. "Everyone knows what to do?" Silent nods all around, each with their role, each aware of the risks. Ethan approached Sentinel one last time, gently placing the old military bridle in his mouth, carefully adjusting the reins. "The time has come, old friend." From his pocket, he took the ultrasonic whistle. But before blowing it, he looked into the animal's eyes that now seemed more alive, more present. "Sentinel, watch point," he commanded, with the same firm voice of years ago. The stallion responded instantly, assuming the alert posture that had characterized his military training. But there was something more, a gleam of recognition, a re-established connection that went beyond electronic circuits and programmed commands. The sound of approaching footsteps preceded firm knocks on the main door. The ultimatum had come to an end. The moment of truth was presenting itself. "Captain Miller," Colonel Vaughan's voice sounded from outside, "the deadline has expired. We have a seizure order for the animal designated as federal property." Ethan mounted Sentinel with a fluid movement, feeling the animal's body respond to his weight as in the old days. Dr. Marina, discreetly positioned at the back of the stable, activated the device that would temporarily interfere with the chip's signals. "We're ready," she whispered in the improvised communicator. Emily at the main house opened the door for the colonel and his entourage, following the established plan. Andrew, strategically hidden, activated cameras that would document everything that was about to happen. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the familiar adrenaline of imminent combat. It was time to confront not just men, but a system that had transformed his companion into a tool that had corrupted principles for greed and power. "Let's go, Sentinel," he murmured. "One last mission together." The stable doors opened. Man and horse emerged under the dawn light, united again, ready for the confrontation that would define not only their future, but possibly the future of the very relationship between humans and animals. The wind blew softly, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and the promise of a new morning. In that moment, as they advanced side by side toward the enemy, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of having a purpose, of fighting for something greater than himself. And Sentinel, overcoming programming and chips, responded to the most fundamental call of all, the invisible bond between two warriors, two souls who had faced the worst together and survived. The battle that would follow would not just be for a horse, but for the right to freedom, dignity, and the genuine connection that no technology could completely replicate or subjugate. A connection that, against all odds, had survived reprogramming, separation, and betrayal. A connection that now, finally restored, would prove stronger than any artificial control ever imposed. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Miller property as Colonel Vaughan and his team approached the stable. The black NeuroSync van had positioned itself strategically near the exit, its rear doors open, revealing a specialized transport compartment clearly designed for an animal. Ethan sat tall in the saddle, feeling Sentinel's powerful body beneath him, tense but responsive in a way that felt achingly familiar. For a brief moment, it was as if the past 5 years had never happened, as if they were back in active duty preparing for a mission. "Captain Miller," Colonel Vaughan called out, his voice carrying across the yard, "this is unnecessary. We have a legal order for the seizure of government property." "This property has a name," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "And he's been subjected to illegal experimentation." Vaughan's expression hardened. He gestured to the men around him, 2 in military uniforms, 3 in civilian clothes, but with the unmistakable bearing of former military, and 1 man in a white lab coat who remained partially hidden behind them. "I'm not here to debate ethics with you, Miller. Step down and hand over the animal." From inside the house, Emily emerged with a tablet in hand. As planned, she approached, confidently, playing her role to perfection. "Colonel, before you proceed, you should know that we've documented everything," she announced, holding up the tablet. "The unauthorized chip implantation, the neurological tampering, the falsified euthanasia records, all of it. And a full dossier has already been distributed to multiple news outlets, with instructions to publish if we don't check in hourly." It was a bluff, but a necessary one. Vaughan's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting momentarily to the man in the lab coat, who stepped forward with visible agitation. "That's absurd," the man said, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "You can't possibly understand what you're talking about." "Dr. Valente, I presume," Ethan called out, recognizing the name from the documents, "the veterinarian who falsified Sentinel's medical records and handed him over to be experimented on. The..." Doctor flinched at being identified, looking to Vaughan for guidance. This small reaction was all the confirmation Ethan needed. They'd hit a nerve. Vaughan maintained his composure, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Whatever you think you know is classified for national security reasons. Interfering with military operations carries serious consequences. So does violating federal animal welfare laws and ethics protocols." Andrew stepped out from his hiding spot, camera in hand, openly filming the confrontation, especially when the evidence suggests human trials were the next phase. The tension in the yard thickened. One of the military officers placed his hand on his holstered weapon, but Vaughan subtly gestured for restraint. Dr. Marina, positioned near the stable's rear entrance, activated her device, a small transmitter designed to interfere with the chip's control signals. Through their concealed earpieces, the team heard her whisper, "Interference active. You have approximately 8 minutes before they can re-establish control." Ethan felt Sentinel respond immediately. The horse's posture straightened, his eyes became more alert, his ears perked forward. Whatever constant signal had been suppressing his natural responses was temporarily blocked. "You know what Project Cerberus really is," Ethan addressed the group, but his eyes were fixed on Vaughan. "Neural control technology tested on military animals, with the ultimate goal of application in human subjects. Soldiers who don't question orders, who don't feel fear, who can be controlled remotely like drones." "That's enough, Miller," Vaughan snapped, his calm facade cracking. "You have no idea what's at stake here. This technology could save countless lives, revolutionize warfare, minimize casualties. By turning living beings into remote-controlled puppets." Riley emerged from behind the house, leaning on his cane. "I've seen the documents, Vaughan. I know what Phase 2 entails. Testing on wounded veterans who volunteered for experimental treatments." This revelation seemed to surprise even some of Vaughan's own men, who exchanged uneasy glances. "That's the real reason you need Sentinel back so desperately," Ethan continued, pressing the advantage. "He's not just any test subject. He's a successful prototype, proof that your technology works long-term without degradation, and without him your funding might be in jeopardy." Dr. Valente stepped forward again, this time addressing Ethan directly. "You don't understand the significance of what we've achieved. The neural interface we've developed is the most advanced in existence. Yes, there were ethical compromises, but the potential benefits to humanity..." "Save your justifications," Ethan cut him off. "I've seen what your achievement did to my partner. You didn't enhance him, you erased him." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. In that moment, Ethan made eye contact with each member of his small team, nodding slightly. It was time for the next phase of their plan. "We're not here to negotiate," Vaughan stated finally, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Hand over the animal now or we'll take him by force." Ethan's response was to raise the ultrasonic whistle to his lips. The sound, inaudible to human ears, triggered an immediate response in Sentinel. The stallion reared dramatically, his front, hooves pawing at the air, a cavalry display move they had performed countless times in military parades. The sudden movement caused Vaughan's men to step back, creating momentary confusion. In that instant, Ethan pressed his heels into Sentinel's sides and the horse bolted forward, charging directly toward the line of men, who scattered to avoid being trampled. This was not an escape attempt. It was a demonstration. Ethan guided Sentinel in a tight circle around the yard, executing a series of precise maneuvers that showcased the perfect harmony between rider and mount. Every turn, every change in pace was performed flawlessly, as if the years of separation had never happened. "Look at him," Emily called out to the increasingly unsettled group. "Does this look like an animal that needed to be improved? Does this look like something that should be controlled by a chip?" The display had the intended effect. Even the military men looked impressed, and one of them whispered something to his colleague that made Vaughn shoot him a warning glance. As Sentinel completed another circuit of the yard, Dr. Marina's voice came urgently through the earpieces. 2 minutes remaining before they can re-establish control. Ethan guided Sentinel to the center of the yard, facing Vaughn and his team. "Here's what's going to happen," he stated, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a military commander. "You're going to leave my property without Sentinel. In exchange, we won't release the evidence we've gathered to the public. Yet." "That's not how this works, Miller," Vaughn replied, though with less conviction than before. "It is today, because if you take him, everything goes public immediately. The project, the falsified records, the illegal experiments, all of it. Your careers, your funding, your freedom, gone." Dr. Valente stepped forward, his face pale. "Colonel, perhaps we should consider—" "Quiet!" Vaughn hissed, but the damage was done. The crack in their united front was visible to everyone. "1 minute," came Marina's warning. Ethan needed to end this now. He dismounted, standing beside Sentinel with one hand resting on the horse's neck. "I'm not asking for much," he said, his voice softer now. "Just leave Sentinel with me. Remove the chip humanely and we'll keep your secret. Continue your research if you must, but not on him. Not anymore." The conflict played out visibly on Vaughn's face, weighing orders against pragmatism, ambition against self-preservation. The seconds ticked by. 30 seconds, Marina warned. Finally, Vaughn raised a hand, signaling to his men to stand down. "This isn't over, Miller." "For today it is," Ethan replied evenly. Vaughn turned to Dr. Valente. "Can the chip be safely removed?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes, it would require specialized equipment and expertise, but it's possible." "Then make the arrangements," Vaughn ordered. Turning back to Ethan, "We'll send a surgical team. After the procedure, all evidence is turned over to us. That's the deal. After I verify the chip is completely removed and Sentinel is unharmed," Ethan countered. Vaughn's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. 2 days. We'll be back with the surgical team. And Miller, don't mistake this for a victory. Projects like Cerberus don't just disappear because one man takes a moral stand. 10 seconds, came Marina's final warning. As Vaughn and his team began to withdraw, Ethan felt Sentinel stiffen beside him. The interference was wearing off. The chip's control functions were reactivating. He quickly placed his hand on the horse's muzzle, looking directly into his eyes. "Stay with me, partner," he whispered. "Just a little longer." Something in Sentinel's gaze flickered. Recognition, determination, or perhaps simply the basic animal instinct to fight against external control. Whatever it was enough. The horse remained steady, even as the NeuroSync van and military vehicles pulled away from the property. Only when the last vehicle disappeared down the rural road did the team allow themselves to exhale. Emily rushed to Ethan's side, her face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "I can't believe that worked," she breathed. "It's not over," Ethan cautioned, still maintaining contact with Sentinel, who was beginning to show signs of distress as the chip reasserted its programming. This was just round 1. Riley limped over, his expression grave but satisfied. "They'll be back, and not just with a surgical team. They'll want to tie up loose ends." "Then we need to be ready," Ethan replied, guiding the increasingly agitated Sentinel back toward the stable. "Dr. Marina, how long can you maintain the interference?" The specialist emerged from her hiding place, equipment in hand. "With modifications, I might extend it to 15 minutes at a time, but the system will adapt. Each interference becomes less effective than the last." 2 days, Andrew mused, reviewing the footage he had captured. "That gives us time to prepare backup plans and secure the evidence. As they moved toward the house to regroup, Dr. Ernest approached Sentinel, examining the horse's increasingly erratic behavior with concern. The transition between control states is causing him significant stress, he observed. We need to stabilize him somehow until the chip can be removed. Ethan nodded grimly. I'll stay with him. My presence seems to help counteract the programming. I'll help set up a monitoring system, Marina offered. We need to better understand the signals being sent to and from the chip. As the others headed inside to plan their next steps, Ethan remained in the stable with Sentinel. The horse's behavior oscillated between moments of lucidity, when he seemed to recognize Ethan and respond to him naturally, and periods of programmed detachment, when his eyes would go vacant and his posture would become rigid and unnatural. We're going to fix this, Ethan promised, settling onto the wooden chair in front of the stall. Whatever they put inside you, whatever they tried to make you into, we're going to undo it. Sentinel regarded him with an inscrutable gaze, caught between two worlds, the artificial reality imposed by the chip and the natural bond that had once defined his existence. In that liminal space, man and horse maintained their vigil, each anchoring the other against the current that threatened to sweep them away. Outside, the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. 2 days until the next confrontation, 2 days to prepare for whatever came next. 2 days to hope that the fragile victory they had won would not dissolve in the harsh light of a new morning. The surgical team arrived exactly 48 hours later, as promised. But unlike the previous confrontation, this time they came without military escort, just a nondescript van with medical equipment and 3 professionals, a veterinary surgeon, an anesthesiologist, and a neural interface specialist. Ethan had spent the intervening time rarely leaving Sentinel's side, sleeping in the stable, talking to the horse for hours, playing the ultrasonic whistle at regular intervals, anything to reinforce their connection and counteract the chip's influence. Dr. Marina had worked tirelessly to create a portable version of her interference device, allowing for brief windows when Sentinel seemed almost his old self. The procedure was set up in the stable, converted into a makeshift operating theater, with bright lights, monitoring equipment and surgical tools arranged with clinical precision. Dr. Ernest insisted on being present as an observer, ensuring every step adhered to proper veterinary protocols. The procedure will take approximately 2 hours, explained the lead surgeon, a Dr. Wilson, as they prepared Sentinel with local anesthetic. We'll be removing not just the main chip, but several micronodules that extend into the surrounding neural tissue. Will there be permanent damage? Ethan asked, standing close as they began sedating the horse. The brain has remarkable plasticity, Doctor, Wilson replied, his tone professional but not unkind. Some neural pathways may have been altered permanently, but others can potentially regenerate or form new connections. The horse's behavior will likely remain somewhat modified, but without the active suppression from the chip, natural instincts should gradually reassert themselves. As Sentinel's eyes grew heavy with sedation, Ethan leaned close to his ear. I'll be right here when you wake up, partner, and this time, nothing between us. The surgery proceeded with methodical precision. Through a small incision at the EI base of Sentinel's neck, the team located and carefully extracted the primary chip, a device smaller than a postage stamp, but bristling with microscopic filaments that had integrated with the surrounding tissue. Each connection had to be severed with exquisite care to avoid damaging the delicate neural structures. Remarkable engineering, murmured the neural specialist as she examined the extracted device. The integration is far more advanced than anything I've seen in clinical applications. Is it transmitting? Ethan asked sharply. The specialist checked her instruments. No, once removed from the host, it powers down completely. The design prevents any data retrieval after extraction. A security feature, I assume. 2 hours, stretched into 3, as the team worked to remove the secondary implants. Tiny nodules positioned at key points in Sentinel's brain that facilitated the comprehensive control the chip had exercised. By the time they closed the final incision, the sun was setting, casting the stable in warm golden light. The procedure was successful, Dr. Wilson announced, removing his surgical gloves. He'll need to remain sedated for at least 12 hours while the initial healing takes place. After that, recovery should be gradual. Expect some disorientation, possibly agitation as his natural neural functions re-establish themselves. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on Sentinel's still form. The stallion's breathing was steady, his vital signs stable according to the monitoring equipment. "What happens now?" he asked, addressing the question to no one in particular. "Now we wait," replied Dr. Ernest, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "And we hope that what makes Sentinel who he is wasn't erased by their tampering." As the surgical team packed their equipment, the neural specialist approached Ethan with a small container holding the extracted chip. "Colonel Vaughn instructed us to return this to the facility," she said quietly. "But I think you should have the option of independent analysis. What they did here, it goes beyond what many of us signed up for." Ethan studied her face, looking for deception but finding only professional concern. After a moment's hesitation, he shook his head. "Keep it. Take it back to them. We've documented everything we need." The specialist seemed surprised by his response, but nodded and secured the container in her case. After the team departed, Ethan settled into his chair beside Sentinel's stall, prepared for the long night ahead. Emily brought him coffee and sandwiches, but he barely touched them, his attention fixed on the rhythmic rise and fall of the horse's flanks. "You need to rest too," she urged. "I can watch him for a few hours." "I need to be here when he wakes up," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "He'll be confused, maybe afraid. He needs to see a familiar face." Emily didn't argue, simply squeezed his shoulder and left him to his vigil. Hours passed, marked only by the soft ticking of the stable clock and the occasional sounds of night creatures outside. Sometime past midnight, Dr. Marina joined him, bringing fresh coffee and her monitoring equipment. "I wanted to check if there are any residual signals," she explained, setting up a small scanner near Sentinel's head. "Sometimes these systems leave an imprint, even after the hardware is removed." Ethan watched as she conducted her tests, finally relaxing slightly when she confirmed there was no activity beyond normal neurological functions. "It's really over then?" he asked, allowing himself to hope for the first time. "The technology is gone," she replied carefully, "but what it did to him, that's not something I can measure. The mind isn't just circuitry, Ethan. It's experience, memory, connection. Some things can't be erased for better or worse." As dawn approached, Sentinel began showing signs of waking, small movements, changes in breathing patterns. Ethan moved closer, speaking softly, maintaining a constant stream of reassurance as the horse gradually emerged from sedation. The moment of truth came as Sentinel's eyes opened, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening. For several heartbeats, he simply stared at Ethan, no recognition visible in his gaze. Then slowly his ears pricked forward, and he made a soft nickering sound, a greeting, tentative but unmistakable. "Hey there, partner," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Boss, welcome back." Over the next few days, Sentinel's recovery proceeded with cautious optimism. There were setbacks, periods of apparent confusion, moments when he would freeze in place as if waiting for commands that no longer came, episodes of agitation that required Dr. Ernest's calming expertise. But there were also breakthroughs, responding to his name, accepting treats from Ethan's hand, showing curiosity about his surroundings in a way that had been absent before. A week after the surgery, Ethan led Sentinel out of the stable into the paddock for the first time. The morning was clear and cool, perfect for gentle exercise. The horse moved stiffly at first, then with increasing confidence as they circled the enclosure. "Let's try something," Ethan said, more to himself than to Sentinel. From his pocket, he withdrew the ultrasonic whistle. This time, instead of using it to trigger trained responses, he blew a simple improvised pattern, 3 short notes, like a question. Sentinel's ears swiveled toward the sound. He turned to look at Ethan, head tilted slightly, as if considering the unfamiliar pattern. Then, to Ethan's astonishment, he responded with a soft whicker and took a step closer. Not the programmed approach of before, but a voluntary movement, a choice. "That's it," Ethan encouraged, his smile spreading wide. You choose now. No Chip telling you what to do, just you and me figuring it out together. From the fence, Emily and Riley watched the interaction with matching expressions of cautious joy. Is he really recovering? Or are we just seeing what we want to see? Emily wondered aloud. Riley considered the question, his experienced eyes evaluating the horse's body language. Both, maybe. He's not the same as before, how could he be? But there's something there, something real. Trust, maybe. Recognition. Will they come back, do you think? Emily asked, lowering her voice despite the distance between them and Ethan. Eventually, Riley replied grimly. People like Vaughn and Bradley don't surrender their ambitions easily, but they'll be more cautious now, more covert. And we'll be ready. In the paddock, Ethan had begun leading Sentinel through simple groundwork exercises, basic commands, gentle guidance, building confidence with each successful response. For now, he wasn't thinking about future threats or unfinished conflicts. For now, it was enough to be here, working with his partner in the morning sunlight, reclaiming piece by piece what had been taken from them both. One day at a time, he murmured, running his hand along Sentinel's neck, feeling the healing incision under his fingertips. One day at a time. Sentinel nudged Ethan's shoulder gently, his eyes clear and present in a way they hadn't been since their reunion. In that moment, something passed between them. An understanding. Beyond words, beyond training, beyond the scars they both carried. A recognition that while neither of them could go back to who they had been before, perhaps they could move forward together toward something new. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting their shadows long across the paddock, Ethan allowed himself to believe that someday, not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday, they would both be whole again. 6 months later, the Miller farm had transformed. The once neglected paddocks now housed 3 additional rescued horses, former military mounts that Andrew had discovered in various states of retirement across neighboring states. Each bore subtle signs of having been part of Project Cerberus, though none had received the advanced neural implants that Sentinel had endured. Ethan had converted the old barn into a rehabilitation center of sorts, working with Dr. Ernest to develop specialized care protocols for horses displaying the unique behavioral issues associated with the project's conditioning techniques. Word had spread quietly through a network of trusted veterinarians and animal welfare advocates, bringing occasional new cases to their door. Sentinel's recovery had plateaued at what Dr. Ernest called a new normal. He would never be exactly the horse he had been before. Some neural pathways had been permanently altered, some behavioral patterns irrevocably changed. But he had regained much of his personality, forming strong bonds with Ethan and showing increasing comfort with other humans and horses. On this particular autumn morning, Ethan was in the round pen with Sentinel, working on liberty exercises, training, without halter or lead rope, based purely on communication and trust. The horse moved in fluid circles around him, responding to subtle body language cues, stopping and changing direction with impressive precision. Emily watched from the fence, a mug of steaming coffee in her hands. "He looks good today," she called out, almost like he's enjoying himself. Ethan nodded, not taking his eyes off Sentinel. Good days are becoming more frequent, bad days less so. When they finished the session, Ethan rewarded Sentinel with apple slices and gentle praise. As they walked back to the stable together, Emily fell into step beside them. "Andrew called this morning," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "He has news." Ethan tensed slightly but kept walking. "What kind of news?" Neurosync is shutting down their animal research division. Officially, it's due to strategic reorganization and funding reallocation. Unofficially, there's been increased scrutiny from oversight committees ever since those redacted documents mysteriously appeared in several senators' inboxes. A small smile flickered across Ethan's face. The mysterious documents had been part of their insurance policy, carefully selected evidence released through secure channels, when it became clear that Vaughn and his superiors had no intention of truly abandoning Project Cerberus. "And Bradley?" he asked. "Resigned last month, reportedly taking a position at a private research facility in Eastern Europe. Emily paused, sipping her coffee. Andrew thinks they're trying to continue the work overseas, away from US regulations. Ethan nodded, having expected as much. And Vaughn? Reassigned to a desk job in Pentagon logistics, quite a demotion for an ambitious colonel. They reached the stable, and Ethan began removing Sentinel's training gear, brushing him down with practiced movements. "It's not over," he said finally. "The technology exists now, the research has been done. Someone somewhere will try again." "Maybe," Emily conceded, "but it won't be as easy next time. Too many people are watching now, asking questions, and the next horse might have someone like you fighting for them." After settling Sentinel in his stall with fresh hay, Ethan walked with his sister back to the house. The property had come alive in recent months, fences repaired, fields maintained, outbuildings renovated. What had begun as a refuge had become a mission. "I got another call too," Emily mentioned as they approached the porch. "That cavalry veteran from Fort Carson, the one with the Appaloosa you thought might have been part of the early trials?" "Matthews?" Ethan recalled the gruff former sergeant, who had reached out after hearing rumors about what they were doing. "He's bringing his horse next week. Says he's been having episodes that the regular vets can't explain." Ethan nodded, unsurprised. More and more cases were emerging as people began recognizing the patterns. "We'll help if we can," he said simply. That evening, after the day's work was done, Ethan returned to the stable for his customary night check. Each horse received a brief visit, a moment of connection, an apple or carrot, a quiet word. He saved Sentinel for last, as always. The black stallion was standing alert at the stall door, as if expecting him. Over the months, they had developed new routines, new ways of communicating, rebuilding their partnership on different terms. No longer soldier and mount, but something more equal, each healing, each supporting the other's recovery. "Big day tomorrow," Ethan told him, stroking the white star on his forehead, a marking that had been dyed black during his time at the Prometheus Institute, now grown out to its natural color. "First trail ride beyond the property line. Think you're ready for that?" Sentinel's ears pricked forward, his eyes bright with what Ethan had come to recognize as enthusiasm. He nuzzled Ethan's pocket, searching for treats. "Always thinking." "With your stomach," Ethan laughed, producing a peppermint, Sentinel's newfound favorite. As he turned to leave, something made him pause. A sound outside. A car on the rural road moving slowly past the property. Probably nothing, just a neighbor or lost tourist. But old instincts died hard. He stepped outside, scanning the darkness beyond the stable lights. For a moment, he thought. He glimpsed a dark sedan similar to the one Vaughn had arrived in months ago, but it disappeared around a bend before he could be certain. Returning to Sentinel's stall, he found the horse standing alert, head high, nostrils flared slightly. "You heard it too, huh?" Ethan murmured, placing a reassuring hand on the horse's neck. "Don't worry, partner. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Sentinel turned his head, meeting Ethan's gaze with that uncanny intelligence that had survived everything they had tried to take from him. In that silent exchange was a promise, not of safety or certainty, but of partnership, of standing together against whatever threats might emerge from the shadows. As Ethan finally made his way back to the house under a canopy of stars, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. The war they had stumbled into wasn't over, might never truly be over. But for the first time since that fateful day 5 years ago, he was no longer running from his past. He was standing his ground, fighting for something that mattered, and he was no longer alone in the battle.